there are very interesting lectures this month. On the 27th of January, at 3 p.m., we have a talk in Hindi, Sahitya Ki Itihas Drishti, by Professor Ganesh N. Devi. On the 28th of January, again at 3, we have a talk called Rahul Sanskritiyan's Revolutionary Relocations by Dr. Maya Joshi. On January 29th, again at 3 p.m., we have Dr. Rukmini Banerjee rendering a talk on literacy to education, how can we make the transition. On 30th at 5 p.m., please note, there's a public lecture by Professor S.R. Mehrotra from Himachal Pradesh University, and the topic is Dr. Pranjeevan Mehta, Gandhiji's greatest friend and benefactor, 1864 to 1932. And finally, on the 31st of January, 3 p.m., a public lecture in the Science, Society and Nature series by Professor Jayant Bandhopadhyay from the Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta. And the topic is the water future of South Asia, the option for advancing ecological engineering. I'd also like to bring to your notice very interesting occasional papers that have been brought out by the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, 63 in number. And there are a number of different series. One is the History and Society series, Perspectives in Indian Development, Samaj Evan Itihas series. And in case anyone is interested, you can contact the office. Each of these publications are available for only ₹100. So with that, I'd just like to begin my introduction. It's an honor to have Professor Ronald Herring here with us today, who will be rendering the inaugural talk this year in the Science, Society and Nature Public Lecture Series, meticulously organized by the NMML. For those of you who are not so familiar with his academic pursuits and contributions in the sphere of political science, Ron has worked extensively on South Asia. His diverse interests in fields such as agrarian political economy and agrarian reform, ethnicity and conflict, political ecology and development, as well as social conflicts around science and genetical engineering. His talk today scrutinizes the synthesis behind divergent outcomes as regards the introduction of two genetically modified crops in the Indian context, BT cotton and BT Brinjal. These crops apparently carry the same transgene and were subjected to identical authorization procedures. However, while BT cotton was widely adopted, the government somehow imposed a moratorium on BT Brinjal. Interpreting these anomalous and perplexing trajectories of these crops is really the content of his talk today, which is really titled State, Science and National Specificity, Cotton to Brinjal in India. A little about Professor Herring. He's currently faculty at the Department of Government, Cornell University, where he has served as director of the Mario Einaudi, I hope I've pronounced it correctly, Center for International Studies, John S. Knight Professor of International Relations and Director of the South Asia Program. He has notable authored and co-authored publications to his credit that reflects his multifaceted interests, such as Land to the Tiller, the Political Economy of Agrarian Reform, Carrot, Sticks and Ethnic Conflict, which he has written with Milton Isman, Transgenics and the Poor, and Whatever Happened to Class with Reena Agarwal. He's currently engrossed in editing the new Oxford Handbook of Food, Politics and Society. The reason why I have rushed through my introduction is I'd like to give more time to Professor Ron, maybe 45 minutes or so, and then we wind up then it's open to all of you for questions, and then we wind up by 4:30. Thank you so much. So over to you, Professor.
Yes. Okay. It's wonderful to be here again. The last time I was here, Mahesh gave me the title for the book, Whatever Happened to Class. So I was forever grateful to Mahesh. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for coming. I'll try to keep to the time. If I'm not making sense, please interrupt me or just say that didn't make any sense to me or it didn't work, so that I have a sense that we're not simply wasting time. So this is This is the question we start with, the receptivity of science in mass publics and the receptivity of science in policy communities, and particularly the receptivity of science that has implications for regulatory and policy outcomes. This is the Barack Obama. This is kind of a famous thing. This is few challenges facing America and the world are more urgent than combating climate change. Science is beyond dispute. Facts are clear. It's a full-page ad in the New York Times taken out by 125 scientists who said, with all due respect, Mr. President, that's not true. And so these are what are called climate science deniers. There are huge numbers of them, and they are often in very prominent places, and they have the kind of credentials you would expect from someone putting an ad in the New York Times. You say, isn't it interesting these people were able to get together and come up with the money it takes to have a full-page ad in the New York Times? Well, these things are mediated by social organizations. These were mediated by the Cato Institute, which is an anti-regulation, pro-market sort of organization that recruited these people. You can see they sent out samples with your name here. This gets to be in the New York Times, and they actually recruited the people and raised the money, were able to pay for this ad. So when we see this science, anti-science sort of conflict around policy, it often has interested parties behind the scenes or interested parties overtly involved in trying to settle science. I think that's the central sort of political problematic. Settled science is what we use for law, for policy. Do we believe that the air that we breathe is safe, that the pharmaceuticals we take are safe, that the Coca-Cola doesn't have pesticides in it? You know, who is assuring us that the state is doing its public goods provision and providing safety to the public? And to the extent that you can unsettle the science that is behind state policy, you can change the basis of that policy. And so that's a constant sort of political tactic, fighting around what is settled science and what isn't. Now, when we get to the topic for today, science development politics, I want to make the center of this talk interest and risk, because much of the global debate around biotechnology has been about science versus anti-science, or, as it's often characterized, junk science, corporate science, reductive science, Western science, etc. All of these are adjectives that suggest that science is plural and contested, right? As opposed to the counter-argument, which is that science is science, that American science about recombinant DNA breeding is no different from European science, is no different from Japanese science. So there's an argument about the reality that science has a common epistemological core, standard protocols for assessing truth, and that these over time weed out the junk science. Junk science will come back because Mr. Seralini is among us. So this is the global debate taking the form. What really matters, though, is not the global debate of some kind of imaginary epistemic community called science. What really matters is national science. And that is specific procedures and institutions for vetting authoritative knowledge for the purposes of law and regulation. Let me just move this up a little bit. Okay, good. So state science mediates this dialectic of interest and risk. Right? States have an interest in scientific progress, obviously. States also have an interest in providing at least acceptable risk to mass publics. And if the state isn't going to vet that sort of question, who will? So this is the public interest in science. Now, science, though, pretends to have no answers to risk. And that's terribly important because much of this debate is about acceptable risk versus unacceptable risk. What do we mean by risk? And science can't give you an answer. It doesn't pretend to have an answer about either values, norms, or about risk and risk preferences. These are matters on which scientists do not speak. State science, though, represents something like a contract with society, and that's why there's so much variation in state science, because institutions may be believed or not believed, they may be trusted or not trusted, they may be believed to have interest or to be driven by interest that are unacceptable to a kind of more pure notion of settled knowledge, but we can build policy around. And then, so we have this national specificity of state science. State science is different in every country, and that variation is over space and time. If you had to ask what is European science of regulation of recombinant DNA plants now, it's all over the map, right? The European Commission demands that nation states comply with its rulings. Nation states continue to defy the European Commission. Court cases have come out again and again and again. The government of Italy has been taken to court and lost several times for banning Mon 810 maize. The farmers have won their case against the court, but they can't make the government of Italy do anything. In fact, the European Commission is so frustrated with their inability to carry out state science as a policy matter that they have suggested the nationalization of science so that regulation will move to the state level. Problem with that is that it's a trading bloc, and you can't have different rules in Austria and Sweden and call yourself a trading bloc. So there's a tremendous contradiction here between the European Union's need for trading bloc status and its ability to impose a rule that's consistent across the whole trading bloc. So this national specificity is not easy to come by. It shows variance over time and space, and of course this was not an accidental reference. India in many ways shows a similar kind of dilemma that we have in Europe. You have a federal system, agriculture is a state subject, there is conflict around where there can be field trials, where there can't be field trials, where there's approval and not approval, and there's no regulatory mechanism in place that can resolve those issues cleanly and clearly. So, okay. Can you hear me without the mic? Is that okay? No? Okay, sorry. I hate these microphones. They're really quick. Oh, keep it here. Okay. Okay. Thank you. So everybody in the room probably has seen this map. It's produced by several people who are in this room, in fact. Bhagarat's here. This is the ISA map of biotech crops. What's interesting about this, there's several interesting things. One is that this is your map of utility. Remember I said this is a dialectic of utility and risk. In virtually every country where transgenic crops have been available and affordable, farmers have taken to them. So just last year, the crossing of these two lines you see, the quote-unquote less developed countries passed the quote-unquote developed countries in terms of total acreage under transgenic crops. Now, I say quote-unquote because the underdeveloped countries include places like Brazil and Argentina, which I don't think of as in the category of Botswana and Haiti. So this is a characterization that's commonly made in the social sciences. This is developed versus underdeveloped countries, and now underdeveloped countries are growing more hectares than our developed countries. There are 28 28 countries that accept biotech crops. India was number 16. In 2002, India was on the cusp for some time, and then 2002 became the 16th country. They're now 28. And the other thing to notice about this map is that, you might have guessed, it's extremely conservative. It's extremely conservative. So, for example, on this map, you'll have Vietnam without any transgenic crops. We know there's both BT cotton and BT rice growing in Vietnam. BT rice has been coming out of China since 2005, but the Chinese have not yet commercialized it. It's showing up in Chinese markets, but they say that they don't have it yet. All of the cone of South America took up crops basically by stealth, underground networks of farmers trading crops, very much as in India with the Nabarat 151, the Nabarat 151 variants. That same kind of process is happening all over the world, wherever farmers find that either the technology fees are too high, or it's too difficult to get, or it's illegal. They've gone to underground networks, replicated their seeds, and come up with alternatives. The alternatives are often more interesting than the originals. You know, instead of Mahiko Monsanto's MEC 162, you come up with Rakshak and Maharakshak and Agni and Lakshmi and these great names for the locally bred varieties. So there is that market everywhere, and I just come from Maharashtra actually, and there's a lot, really a lot of Roundup Ready BT Bollgard 2 maize cotton growing out there. We don't know the extent, obviously. And of course, there's some argument that BT Brinjal is available as well, and we just don't know. I don't have any verified reports on Brinjal. I do know that for at least 3 years we've had glyphosate-tolerant BT cotton growing in India, but it's not approved by anybody. And this is spreading the same people that spread BT cotton with the Cry1AC originally. Okay, so this is a conservative map, but it's a map that shows kind of the utility increasingly spreading to countries where they're allowed and to some countries where it's not allowed, but this is a matter of national specificity. If you look at the map, it's hard to figure out why you have the pattern that you have. And one reason is the national specificity of state science. Okay, so let's look at the grounds for having state science in a regulatory mode dealing with transgenic crops. Standard science, risk is equal to hazard times exposure or hazard times incident, depending on what kind of hazard you're talking about. I always use examples of air travel and surgery. I've done both of those recently. And you look into this and you say, that's right, some 6% of the people have serious problems, some not too minimal percent of the people in surgery die. And of course, airplanes are the same thing. My mother would never fly an airplane because she said, they fall out of the sky and then you're dead. So she would never get into an airplane. But I do get into airplanes, so what we do is we take risk all the time. I mean, we just accept, we call this acceptable risk, or we think about a sort of normalized risk in which the utility overcomes the probability of hazard. So, but we're dealing with some kind of known probability distribution. We know what surgeons do well in surgery. We know which ones do badly. You can order all the hospitals in the United States by their experience in surgery, and you can find out what your risk is pretty closely, although no individual can ever know his particular or her particular risk. Okay, and I want to emphasize that this is the way we think about risk as human beings. We think about it in comparative terms. You know, I'll take that risk. I want to go to India. I need to be on an airplane. The economist Jack Knight wrote in the 1920s, I think one of the most fundamental points about uncertainty and risk, and he says when the hazard is unknown or not measurable, we are not in a world of risk, but in a world of uncertainty. So risk proper allows a calculation of trade-offs. You know, I could take the plane to New York City, or I could take the train, or I could take an automobile, all of which have different risk distributions, and those are kind of knowable, at least in principle and actually often knowable. Uncertainty, on the other hand, is not like risk. It is completely open to social construction. In fact, all risk is socially constructed. Right? It's individually subjective, but when you talk about risk in a social setting, it is socially constructed. I just give you Jack Knight's original from 1924, and you can read it yourself. But you see his basic point here that this fundamental misinformation about risk and uncertainty has caused a lot of problems in our analytical procedures. I think about cell phones. There's actually quite a bit of evidence out there that cell phones may be hazardous, but the hazards are not established. So the labels in Scandinavia will tell you what the emissions are of different cell phone brands. But we don't actually know that your brain is being cooked by a microwave oven. There's some suspicion that it might be, but it is not known. So the risk distribution is not known. Some people worry about cell phones. Some people suggest you don't give them to children. People my age, it doesn't matter. I mean, what could happen, right? Already half brain dead. So, but cell phones are a good example because we don't know how to calculate a risk when there's no hazard identified and there's no notion of a probability distribution. This becomes critical in evaluation of new technologies, right? And all new technologies, including coffee and the automobile, have faced tremendous opposition on grounds of risk. Okay, so we try to think in regulatory theory about incremental or comparative risk. So regulation of DNA crops in India is theoretically based on incremental risk, which means specifically if you take an isogenic variety and compare it to the isogenic variety with the transgene attached, what differences do you get in outcome of the performance of that genome before and after. And then when you see a difference in performance, you try to ask, is there a hazard involved in that performance? And then, let's say the hazard is produced by a protein, then we try to ask, then what's the incidence or exposure of that protein in the fields? This became very important in the great monarch butterfly conflict. There's no question that insecticidal proteins kill butterflies. That's what they're meant to do. That's the whole purpose of an insecticidal protein. It kills lepidopteran. But on the other hand, the question is, what's the incident compared to spraying the field with organophosphates or synthetic pyrethroids? So that's the way we think about risk. And the logic of the developmental state. I said that there's a kind of a developmental state logic to this, and there's a precautionary state logic to this. So development means realizing potential. So the developmental state looks to solutions to problems that relieve obstacles to realization of potential. And that means there's kind of an elective affinity for incremental risk. You're always comparing the risk of something new to the risk of continuing to do what you're doing and foregoing the benefits of doing something new. So empirically, if you look around the world, ministries of agriculture and science technology take an incremental risk position and tend to be much more pro-recombinant DNA work than other ministries. India's visions of developmental uses of biotechnology were bold and broad. The results have been less so. We all kind of know about Bikaner Narma. There's not all of the public sector efforts have gone well with biotechnology. But it's also true that India did not put regulation of recombinant DNA crops in the ministries of science and technology or in the Ministry of Agriculture. It came in the Ministry of Environment. And Sarah Ramesh is right here. Well, welcome. Anyway, I'll try to avoid saying anything negative about the Ministry of Environment. So these are the logics of the precautionary state. Okay, the precautionary state has a different characteristic position vis-a-vis risk, uncertainty, and change. Precaution is privileged, but it's very hard to define. One of my best friends that talks about the precautionary principle, he says, the idea is that you would never get out of bed in the morning because you can't prove something bad won't happen. And my answer was, you also can't stay in bed because you can't prove that something bad won't happen to you staying in bed. So the precautionary principle is logically almost impossible to define. It's hard to know how precautionary is precautionary enough if you don't have a hazard and you don't have a risk distribution. Okay? So uncertainty in the precautionary principle is coded as risk. If you're not sure about something, you code it as a risk. Right? Contrary to Knightian uncertainty. The meta-disposition is protection and preservation. Okay? And that means you're working with something that is fragile or that needs preservation. So environment ministries are nicely aligned for the precautionary principle. The environment is something that is intricately balanced. You can't see the effects often. They're often interrelated in untraceable ways. And so environmental effects take a long time to work out. They're hard to measure. And you don't know what might happen over time. And therefore, environment ministries globally tend to be much more oppositional vis-a-vis transgenic crops than do ministries that are involved with development more directly. In fact, some purposes of an environment ministry are to prevent development, since development itself is destructive by definition. It may be creative destruction, but it's destructive. Okay, so national specificity. How would we think about this? You can characterize these characteristics. I'll talk about in a little bit what those characteristics are, but you can look at them as bundles. And these might be promotional. China in the early years, tremendously successful public sector development of biotech. Brazil in later years, Embrapa has become extraordinarily effective at international hookups and its own research. So these are sort of promotional kinds of stances after a huge struggle in Brazil. It is a struggle against the environment ministry, and the environment minister quit. Right? Marina Silva quit the government. So there's a struggle there, but it turns out Brazil is more promotional now. Permissive, I'd put the United States, Argentina, Spain. Precautionary, UK, Germany. Germany has gone back and forth on Mon 810 maize for planting. And then prohibitive, Austria, Hungary, Greece, a number of European countries say that under no conditions will they allow any field trials. You can't fly an airplane over them if it has transgenic stuff in the airline meals. That was a joke, but extremely prohibitive, okay, preventative, and these are path dependent, right? The way in which biotechnology is plugged into a state apparatus tends to be path dependent, and it's often very difficult to change. So, for example, India's law can be changed by gazette. That is the Environmental Protection Act can allow changes in the actual operation of state science by the minister signing off on a change in rules. That couldn't happen in the United States, where it would take an act of Congress to change something so fundamental. And different countries have different ways of managing how you get out of the path dependency of the way you started. But institutions tend to reproduce themselves. Okay, so they're path dependent. Now, what are the dimensions of risk assessment? One of the most important is product versus process. For example, herbicide-tolerant plants. You can produce herbicide-tolerant plants by various means of breeding. Some are molecular and some are not. Some might be mutagenic. And therefore, the question is, do we evaluate an herbicide-tolerant crop on the basis of the product, what it does, or on the basis of the process by which it's made? And you might say, well, obviously you only care about the thing itself. You don't care about the process with which it's made. But that may not be true. Think about a circuit board. A circuit board might be produced by a robot in a factory, or it might be produced by a human being. And you may not want one produced by a human being because of the risk involved in working in a factory who use heavy solvents, and it's not a nice place to work, and it's probably a sweatshop. So you may actually prefer a circuit board made by a robot to one made by a human being, and you're judging on process, not product. But that's a huge differentiation in the logic of assessing transgenic crops. Do you care how the trait got into the plant or not? And if you care how the trait got into the plant, does it matter what those processes are? So one classic case is, that we'll talk about later on, the difference between transgenesis and mutagenesis. There are 259 crops produced by mutation breeding in India in the ground, registered by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Right? There may be more, but those are the ones that are registered with the Atomic Energy Agency. One of them is by the way, a Brinjal, and the Dehradun local. And it's engineered to make a pretty toxic alkaloid, which is used in steroid production, psilocybin. So it's out there. It didn't go through the same process as the BT Brinjal, but it is available as a plant that's regularized in India. So it doesn't go before the bar of state science, right? Nor did any of the other mutagenized plants in India. So these are distinctions that you can make across regulatory systems, and those may turn out to be very important. And then the other things are pretty obvious. Standards of evidence. Who generates the data? What data for how long? Do you look at agroeconomic data? In a liberal market economy, you often don't care what the effect is on farmers because you say, oh, farmers make the right decision, they'll make the right decision. It's their choice. In India, as in some other countries, you pay very close attention to the agroeconomic effects of a new crop. So the biosafety procedures have something to do as well with biosafety for the farm family, which I personally think is a very good idea, but it's different from the way that a liberal market economy would evaluate technical change. The technical change is going to be decided by market mechanisms. If people like it, they will buy it. If they don't like it, they won't. Bus. Okay. So then, how can institutional rules be made? I mentioned that. And the location, the state structure. Where do you put your regulatory authority? Who decides on what state science will rule? And India is different from other places. So first of all, these comparative cases, I think these things are very well known, so I won't spend any time on them. I can't believe the amount of controversy that BT cotton has raised as an agronomic issue. As an agronomic issue, it's unbelievable how much controversy has been raised by BT cotton. But as a project of the developmental state, this is something the Department of Biotechnology wanted to push in India. It's performed pretty much as tested by state science. If you look at the field trials, look at the performance, it's really pretty close. You get higher yields, less pesticide, higher farm income, near universal adoption by both large and small farmers. And then India graduated from being an importer, a major importer of cotton, to a major exporter and passed the United States in exports in 2010. So as a project of the developmental state, it's probably a good idea, and it succeeded in doing a lot of the things that you would want a developmental state to have done. This is Shad Pawar talking about BT cotton last month or 2 months ago. And you see the point here about kind of the national interest involved in this and the interest of farmers. And I think that is the standard story, and I think the empirical case on this is really well established, and it's not necessary to go into. So Brinjal comes along, same transgene, same protein, same purpose. The idea is one gene that does one thing, and that is insect resistance, to make the plant less susceptible to insects. It failed to be approved for release to farmers after 9 years of testing in these regulatory systems. So it was put before the bar of state science, unlike the Dehradun local, which was mutagenized, and it failed to gain approval. By the way, there are only 5 mutagenized brinjals listed in the International Atomic Energy Agency's list of mutagenized plants. 4 of them are in Italy, and 1 is in India. This has got to be Sonia Gandhi, right? Okay, so why does India need a BT Brinjal? Right? If we're going to take a risk, and there's certainly huge amounts of feeling in India that there's a risk involved in this process, why would you need it? Brinjals are in good supply, lots of biodiversity, lots of brinjals available. Why would you need a BT? This is the answer. It's this really ugly Ludinodes urbalis, this fruit borer. Can destroy up to 70% of the crop. Now, the problem with this guy is that after the egg hatches, he bores almost immediately into the stem or the fruit. So he's not reachable by a topical pesticide. And I just was talking to some brinjal farmers recently, and they said, yes, we'd like BT Brinjal. We really want BT Bindi because we spray that even more. But they spray every 2 to 3 days for brinjals. Many of the things that you spray on brinjals are not supposed to be sprayed within 5 days of harvest. But you don't want to go to the market with a big fat brinjal fruit with worms in it, right? So they spray right up until the last minute. And the farmers I was talking to recently said that unanimously, we do not feed our family the brinjals we take to market. They're too heavily sprayed. We don't trust it. Nor do we feed them the bindi that we take to market. So we grow some stuff for ourselves that has lower yield, and then we grow stuff for the market, and then other people can watch out for their own welfare. This is just an example of the damage caused by these brinjals. So this is what state science said about why does India need a BT Brinjal? Well, current practices, extensive pesticides, are harmful to health and environment, but non-sustainable. Okay? There's an urgent need for developing alternative control, okay? But there are no resistant traits in the genome. It would be nice if you could just cross 2 different varieties of brinjals, have a sexual cross, and then come up with something that carried the right gene. But there are no resistant traits in the genome, according to the people. Everything I've read says that they haven't been able to find one. It may be there, but nobody knows about it. And transgenic crops engineered using the cry proteins give excellent results in cotton and maize. And the similar approach is expected to do the same thing in brinjal. So the idea is that cry proteins are a known technology out there that's been able to control some pest in some plants. So this is just putting a trait into a plant. And this is, how do we know that? These are the normal science of field trials. So I want to say that both in the food safety realm and in the realm of agroeconomic surveys and tests for things like weediness and gene flow and so on, India pretty much follows international procedures. And this is the way that the testing went. Notice that after the tests were done for the hybrid to see if the hybrid brinjals performed well and seemed like viable plants, they then tested the open-pollinated varieties. This is terribly important because the open-pollinated varieties are being released in Bangladesh very soon, we hear. The open-pollinated varieties, you can save the seeds. Yields are lower, but you can save the seeds, and therefore, some farmers may well prefer. 60% of the brinjals grown in India now are open-pollinated varieties. 40, I don't know if my eco people are here, somebody correct me, but I think it's roughly that that kind of relationship. So Mahiko donated the gene to the public sector on the grounds that as soon as people got used to growing BT Brinjals as open pollinated varieties, they might migrate to the hybrids, which have higher yield but are more expensive to produce because you have to do the hybridization. Okay, so the conclusions of state science, this is 2009. Effective in controlling target pests, safe to the environment, non-toxic, non-allergenic, has a potential to benefit farmers. Okay, that's the conclusion of the state science. I just want to show you a couple of tables on what that means. Concretely, this is just BT yield difference between non-BT counterparts, which is roughly isogenic, and national checks, which is locally popular crops that people grow. And you see the yield difference is really pretty big. It also shows tremendous variance. You look at the low and high differences in yields, the means of these tests. And then this is the economic effects, which is the means of all three test modes. The mean cost of pesticides comes down pretty dramatically over the non-BT counterparts. The increased yield, and this is like cotton, you just have more harvestable crop because it's less damaged, ends up being another large amount of money. And then there's a net economic advantage over BT. The pesticide cost saved plus the yield effects. Okay, so this is their risk and hazard assessment. We said that risk means hazard times incidence. So what did state science say about that in India? Should be a quotation. I didn't do a quotation mark. Pesticide exposure causes ill effects. Well, you can read them: neurotoxic, birth and reproductive. List a bunch of these effects. Some pesticides have long residual effect, reported to be possible, probable carcinogens. Okay, so that's one of the hazards involved in current praxis in Brinjal. There's alarming evidence of residue of one insecticide, an organophosphate. It's not permitted for use on vegetables, but there is evidence that this is being used on vegetables in India on Brinjal. In contrast, they have no concerns for food safety in the transformed brinjals of the BT protein. Just as BT topical sprays have long ruled biosafe in India, and there are dozens of firms that make biopesticides in India with spraying whole bacterial cells or spores or some combination of all of these plus the exudates on crops for control. It's a very inefficient and difficult way to control insects for reasons we can talk about if you want to, but it does mean that if the sepal grows over a BT cell that you've sprayed on top of the plant and then you cook the plant, you have the same BT bacterium that you would have had you eaten it, except that you'd have to cleave the protein and your gut can't do that. But in neither case do you have a receptor in your gut for that protein. So it seems as though there is, according to state science, the difference between using a topical spray and using the internal mechanism for producing an insecticidal protein is pretty much comparable. So this runs to the larger issue of global science, right? So national science is always kind of in check with global science. This is a 2010 report, and there are a lot of other ones. I've cited some as a paper I've written about this, but there are a lot of others. But this one is good because it's hard to accuse the European Union of being in the pocket of Monsanto. This is a result of their EU-funded GMO research. So this allows the Commission and policymakers to contribute to the international debate. They want to be in the international debate, provide scientific support for regulatory frameworks and initiative. And you could read the part in red. The main conclusion from this large number of studies, large numbers of independent workers funded by the EU, is that biotechnology, in particular GMOs, are not more risky than, for example, conventional plant breeding technologies. Now, we don't think much about how traits get into plants, but anytime you start moving genes around, whether by sexual crosses or by mutagenic processes or whatever, you're always running some kind of uncertainty. You're not totally sure what's going to come out of that. Potato with more solanine than you thought you were going to get. No matter how you made it, it may not be good for you. So we don't know about the differences across plants, but we do know that they can't find a difference that suggests that recombinant DNA is more risky. Okay. But epistemologies differ. This is a destruction of DNA field trials, rDNA field trials in Belgium. This is important because this is a place where there really is a difference between science and non-science. If you can't have field trials, you have no data from which to make a conclusion about risk or anything else. And so the forbidding of field trials is a statement that we know the answer before we do the science, and that is fundamentally in contradiction with the way that science operates. And that is not an uncommon social mobilization globally. Okay, and here we have, I think you would like this. So the minister is with us today. Looked at the science that the GEAC had produced and had a number of reasons for not accepting its validity or not feeling it was conclusive or that enough had been done to solve the issue. And I must say, and I'm not just being nice, it was extraordinary how transparent, open, and well-publicized all of this thinking was. It was really truly wonderful. A lot of things happen in the United States we never know until there's a Freedom of Information Act filed. We don't know how decisions are made, but this was very clear. We knew exactly how the decision was made, and the rejection was that we just didn't have enough information. The tests weren't convincing enough. There were reasons to worry that we had not solved the level of safety to a point that the public interest was certainly protected, and therefore a moratorium was declared on Brinjal, in which we still sit. Now, what is the opposition? I won't read all of this, but you can see pretty much there are three big issues involved in this opposition. And I think the most interesting thing, Minister Ramesh said, the moratorium will continue for as long as needed to establish public trust and confidence, and all stakeholders are satisfied that they have been heard to their satisfaction. Frankly, that's an impossible task. We still have a majority of the Republican Party in the United States that doesn't believe in global warming. A huge percentage of them don't believe in evolution. We still have 9/11 deniers. We have people that don't think they're moon landings. And I'm quite serious. You have Holocaust deniers, global networks of Holocaust deniers. I don't think you're ever going to have all stakeholders satisfied. Public trust and confidence, of course, is a very difficult thing to come by. And it's true that it's hard to come by, but we don't know, I don't think we know how majoritarian one would have to be and what the mechanism would be to let democracy decide in the face of expertise. That tension between expertise and democracy, the sort of the Ahmad me out there and the scientist out there, I don't think we know what the mechanism is for deciding. In the United States, we have referenda. We've been having referenda in American states on whether GMOs should be labeled or not. That's one mechanism. An act of Congress would be another. And so it's hard to know what that mechanism should be to establish enough trust and confidence that you can go forward with the technology. And as I said, a developmental state errs on the side of moving forward if they think the risk of not moving forward is high. The precautionary state does not move forward. Okay. And I think Suman Sahai's point here is also a very good one. She said, the crisis is that we'll never be able to guarantee total safety. I cannot see a day when we can remove precautions on GE research. It's not a crisis for Suman Sahai. That's what she wants to have happen. But total safety, right? You couldn't grow the peanut in India if you wanted total safety. There is no plant for which you can prove total safety. In fact, one of the nice things about the disputes around uncertainty is the black swan phenomenon, right? We have accumulated knowledge that we think we have a risk distribution of something, and the black swan shows up. We didn't believe there was a black swan. So something always unusual can happen. Donald Rumsfeld said there are always unknown unknowns, right? That's always true. So complete safety, total safety, complete confidence is an unreachable standard. And then food safety, finally, Seralini's science. The one paper that was available, which is not peer-reviewed and was organized by Greenpeace, by Seralini, with the hazards of the BT protein, organ toxicity, and death. There is probably no study, out of the thousands of studies of BT proteins, there's no other study that's been so widely cited and so widely controversial. This particular study wasn't published, but his subsequent study, his prior study was rejected by the Food Safety Authority for basically scientific malpractice. His subsequent work in the Journal of Chemical and Food Toxicology was retracted by the journal just a few months ago. So Seralini's science has consistently shown something that other scientists have found fringe or unacceptable. But he was certainly, 5 minutes. Okay, we got to move much faster. Okay, so picture's worth 1,000 words. This is the movement against the Brinjal. Monsanto, I think this is another interesting point. Monsanto gets a lot of flack. I think empirically it's the most hated company in the world. But interestingly enough, there were more open-pollinated varieties in the public sector ready for release than there were hybrids from Mahiko. So Monsanto really didn't have much to do with this. The event was a Mahiko event. The public sector provisioning, if people wanted public sector brinjals, they would have had them. And it's not clear how Mahiko could force anyone to buy a hybrid if people preferred an OPV, where you can save your seeds. Biodiversity, I still don't understand the mechanisms. And then the previous failure of state regulatory mechanisms, that is the GEAC as an institution, was tarred by a number of errors. There's no government institution that doesn't have something bad in its record, I'm sure. But it also had a number of problems, one of which was its inability to control the spread of stealth BT cotton, not even noticing it and then not being able to control it. This is probably everybody knows these things. This is Kovitch, one of the farmer-bred stealth varieties. This is an F2 on the left, which is sort of taken straight from the gin, transgenic. And then on the right is the Kovitch, and the middle is an actual legitimate licensee of Mahiko Monsanto Biotech for Rasi. So there was a lot of stealth seed activity out there, and it wasn't either noticed for a long time or controlled. And that undermines the notion that you have a safe procedure for dealing with the technology if you believe the technology is dangerous. Okay? So assume the risk. It's pretty clear that the state institutions dealing with it prove themselves to be wanting. There was an unsuccessful counter-mobilization of scientists. I won't talk about this. It's just that there was a pretty significant movement by, I was surprised, a lot of scientists in India took up cudgels to fight for the GEAC conclusions, and a petition to the agriculture minister on 4/23/10. It's very interesting. It was to the agriculture minister, right? So this is 540 scientists signed a petition, and they took it to the ag minister saying, we want this decided in a forum about agriculture, not a forum decided by environment. But of course, that's barking up the wrong tree, because the agriculture minister has no way to approve a crop when the GEAC is in the Ministry of Environment's control. So they tried forum shifting. This is their statement. I won't bother with it, but you can see what they're trying to argue. So cotton farmers won out over the precautionary state. That is, the government wasn't willing to release BT cotton until their hand was forced. The governments of Gujarat and Maharashtra said, we're not going to wait. Our farmers have already taken up some of this crop, and we're deciding they're going to give it the rest of them. So cotton farmers won against the precautionary state. The state GEAC was more precautionary than farmers, and they won. This is not possible for brinjal, and the reasons I think are pretty clear. Very few organized brinjal farmers. They're small in numbers, small in acreage. There's no connection to any forward linkages. Brinjal doesn't go into anything except your gullet. And there's no real organization around brinjal the way there was around cotton. So my conclusions on state science, and I'll try to be very brief. Do I have enough? A couple of minutes? Good. Okay. First of all, science is inherently vulnerable in politics. That's what the first slide was. Getting consensus on the Kyoto Protocol or anything about global warming has been extraordinarily difficult. We can't even give vaccines in the United States, the campaign against vaccines. So science is inherently vulnerable because of its epistemological commitments. Tentative conclusions, limited findings, subject to revision. No scientist can ever tell you, I'll guarantee that any crop is safe. that any technology is safe. If a person is doing that, he or she is not a scientist. They're making some kind of prophetic statement, okay? Versus the certainty of burning field trials or banning field trials. This is a certainty that comes from a fundamentalist appreciation of the absence of scientific evidence, okay? Then finally, rDNA agriculture is especially vulnerable. And that's because successful framing of rDNA crops has put them into administrative choke points, where one person de facto can overrule 9 years of science. That's an extraordinary choke point in which very few people are making a decision about something that could have repercussions for the entire country. The cognitive distance from agriculture is huge, and the cognitive distance from rDNA is huge. Almost nobody that I talk to knows very much about molecular breeding, and very few people know very much about agriculture. We've just come too far away from agriculture. We don't know how traits get into plants. We really don't. So those two things mean high information cost, and that means there's a lot of epistemic brokerage. We rely on people who are epistemic brokers, especially those in networks who can have access to the media, and the media amplify their messages. This is a major finding of social psychology now about network effects in highly polarized communities. Okay. So I think this is pretty straightforward, right? I said why it's vulnerable. What's next? I think stealth Brinjal is probably out there, at least the OPVs. And the BRAI has similar difficulties to the EU, as I pointed out. It's not clear how you can put together all the constituents into something that will work and gain sort of public trust and confidence. So finally, risk. This is my last slide. Risk of biosafety regulatory regimes. It's not just that we have risk from plants or risk from technologies. We have risk from regulatory regimes. This is the Goldilocks paradox. You want it to be not too much, not too little, but just right, the amount of regulation, right? If it's too little, you might have hazards. Bad things could happen if you don't regulate. Think about an airline industry without enough regulation, or Coca-Cola with the pesticides, right? But if you have too much, you advantage large firms and MNCs over small firms in public science. It's very clear. It's an international phenomenon. It empowers officials over farmers, which I don't think is a good idea. Scarce public resources are wasted and investment dries up. Why would anyone dedicate their career to a technology that can be overruled without any kind of mechanism for redress? I mean, why would anyone invest either money or time or career in this kind of technology? So agriculture is needlessly crippled. I mean, imagine if you didn't have BT cotton. The same arguments were made against. Imagine if you didn't have BT cotton. Okay. And the environment's damaged. The amount of pesticides kept out of the environment is so significant. And then farmers are deprived of the same technical progress that urban people enjoy. Urban people have been perfectly happy with recombinant DNA. In Europe and in the United States and even in India, you have your insulin's made by GMOs, right? So that puts the urban bias on a kind of structural basis of urban versus rural. And I'll thank you.
Thank you so much for that invigorating talk. Yeah, it makes all of us very uncomfortable, though, and I'm sure there are lots of people here feeling restless and uncomfortable to ask questions. So the floor is open. Would you like to take a number of questions together or one at a time?
Let's see.
Okay.
Let's see.
Yes, please.
You seem troubled by the different outcome in the case of brinjal and cotton. But it would appear that it's obvious that there should be different processes for the two. One is for human consumption, but you don't wear a brinjal, you eat it, and cotton you wear. So merely because there are different outcomes for these two, why should you be so surprised about it? And that's one. And secondly, even before these BT debates started, long before this, the Indian farmers certainly knew that whenever new varieties are developed, if they are developed because they are high yielding, they're not necessarily more nutritious or more tasty. And food is to